We start with a luxurious multi-story school. The students were chatting animatedly during a break. One of them, at the back of the classroom, was sitting alone, his black hair covering his eyes, completely isolated, although he was not unaware of his surroundings, as he was the first to notice a boy entering the room. This boy was a brown-haired one who shouted to everyone in the room to get their attention, saying that his boss Choi had arrived, and they should greet him. One of the groups called him over in a friendly manner, and a girl took the opportunity to ask if he was selling new products. In an arrogant manner, Choi asked her if she knew who she was talking to and showed her his sales record on his phone. 48 million won earned so far this month. Upon this revelation, everyone was surprised and started congratulating him. One of the guys asked if they would meet up to drink on Friday, which he confirmed. However, he added that he had some matters to attend to first and approached the table of the lonely black-haired boy. He called him by his name, Park Han-jun, and immediately grabbed his head and slammed it against his desk, asking if he was ignoring him. Then, he began lifting and slamming the boy's head against the desk while scolding him for not buying all his new products as he had demanded, with the other boy doing nothing, and asked him mockingly if he wanted to bankrupt him. The girl from earlier asked Choi if he was not worried that a teacher would reprimand him for assaulting another student. But despite trying to show concern, she couldn't help but laugh at Han-jun's suffering. To this, Choi simply said that teachers are also human, so he would just have to pay for their silence. One of the guys noted that they don't accept bribes, which annoyed the brown-haired boy, and of course, he retaliated by punching Han-jun in the face. However, as he pulled back his fist, he realized that the black-haired boy was directing a look of absolute hatred at him. Despite this, the boy continued to taunt him, asking why he wasn't defending himself if he was angry and even daring him to report it, promising to pay him if he did. He went from smashing his face against the table to hitting him in the face while holding him by the hair. While beating him up, he reminded the boy of how his life had been ruined since he lost to Kim Chin-soo. This triggered the protagonist's thoughts, recalling that it all happened 2 years ago. There was a group of high school students known as Nexus, and he had declared war on them with the goal of facing their leader, Kim Chin-soo. In the end, he had defeated him, leaving them all unconscious around him in the pouring rain. But when he believed victory was his, the members of Nexus sued him, and due to the false statements they gave collectively and the fabrication of evidence, he lost the trial. To pay the compensation, his father had to sell the gym where he had worked his entire life. After the trial, in tears, he made a promise never to fight again. While watching helplessly as things were taken from inside the gym, Han-jun apologized to his father, but he only hugged him and told him in the most understanding and loving way that men shouldn't cry. Despite his encouragement, the protagonist learned something that day. If you don't have money, you lose even if you win. After classes were over, Han-jun returned home in the evening, and on the way, he encountered a trio of guys talking about going to a cyber cafe. They recognized him as the guy who became useless after fighting Nexus. Because of this, one of them took off his jacket and approached Han-jun threateningly, asking if he knew what his ring meant. Han-jun looked at it and recognized it as a symbol of his affiliation with Nexus. Next, we see the protagonist on the ground while the shaved-headed guy kicked him all over his body, wondering how someone so useless could have faced Nexus. To this, one of his companions commented that, of course, he would be like this, considering he had ruined his father's life. Hearing this, Han-jun stopped a kick that the leader was about to deliver to his face, looking at the trio with hatred. He quickly released him and apologized, saying he lost his temper for a moment. This action surprised the group, who stared at the protagonist, trembling. Although the leader of the group later regained his composure and got angry, thinking that he had been scared by his gaze. With bulging veins, he grabbed a piece of wood and, in retaliation, used it to beat him, mocking him by asking if he was a worm squirming so much. He continued to beat him with all the wooden sticks until they broke, and then he left with his friends, saying that it had tired him out. As they were about to leave, a blonde guy approached Han-jun with a briefcase to mock him for not defending himself. But then he realized that he couldn't do it because he didn't have enough money to defend himself. Therefore, he emptied his briefcase, showing several bundles of bills, declaring that with that money, he would have more than enough to hire the best lawyers to represent him. Therefore, now he could defend himself, so he asks Han-jun, now that he's covered, how long it would take him to deal with those bastards, speculating about 4-5 minutes. The protagonist looks at him seriously and asks who he was, to which the blonde simply answers that he was someone who wanted to kill Kim Chin-soo but couldn't say more as there were too many ears around. The guys who beat up the protagonist returned upon seeing the blonde approach. The leader asked who he was, but upon seeing the money, his attitude changed to a more jovial one, and he mockingly said that they wouldn't have beaten him so much if he had told them he had so much money, and he tried to pick up the bills on the floor, implying they would leave him alone if he gave them everything he had. However, as soon as he took a step, the protagonist attacked the leader with his elbow, breaking his nose and leaving him unconscious on the ground, much to the surprise of the other two guys. Then, he boldly approached the blonde and told him that it would only take him 4 seconds to finish them all. The two lackeys looked at the protagonist, scared, and tried to defend themselves by arguing that they hadn't touched him at any point, and even tried to blame each other for the insults. Nevertheless, Park Hae-jun showed no mercy and beat both of them, leaving them incapacitated on the ground, just like their leader. He then approached the blonde and asked him, now that no one could hear them, who he was. The man smiled, and we then see them on top of a tall building at night, where he had taken the protagonist to reveal his identity. He indicated that he didn't recognize him because he didn't watch the news and showed him his phone to display a page with his business profile. Oh Junwoo, the youngest and most successful scammer in Korea, the president of the Oj Group. To this information, Junwoo added arrogantly that he could blow his nose with a 10 million bill if he wanted. He then revealed to the protagonist that, currently, Kim Chin-soo was at the pinnacle of society, surrounded by friends and money. Born with a silver spoon, he had become the most impressive professional gamer in the whole country, a source of pride for Korea. He said this with a crazed smile as he continued to explain that Chin-soo had even started gathering various thugs into his organization, like a gangster, something that, in Junwoo's opinion, was unjust since he had ruined Han-jun's life, and now he was living in luxury. Junwoo made it clear that it wouldn't be difficult, with his resources, to destroy Junwoo and his organization, but that wasn't his desire. He wanted to ruin his life using the same dirty, cheap, and disgusting methods that he used. For this, he offered to cover all the expenses that Han-jun needed to find him, and in return, he would take care of paying for all his activities for the rest of his life, and even ensure that his father regained his gym. He just needed to lend him his fists. That was the reason he was looking for him. The protagonist didn't immediately accept but asked him the reason for his hatred towards Kim Chin-soo. Junwoo didn't answer that, instead downplaying it and stating that he would find out in due time. For now, it was a matter of one having the money and the other having the fists to achieve that goal. The next time the protagonist goes to school, he arrives with long strides, forcefully opening the door, immediately grabbing Choi's attention, who threatens to hit him for not having bought his merchandise yet. This, as the protagonist remembers that his new boss had told him that there was a Nexus member in his school he had to deal with. Money makes the world go round. Honor, human relationships, quality of life, money makes everything easier. That's why the protagonist has no qualms about delivering a direct punch to Boss Choi, breaking his nose, and leaving everyone present surprised. Choi recalls his past when he was the strongest of them all, and no one could challenge him. That power ended the day he met him, Park Hae-jun, whom he saw as powerless that day when he faced Nexus alone, possessing a monstrous strength, as if he had a sixth sense, and he admitted that he was superior to him, impossible to defeat in a fight. Yet, Kim Chin-soo was able to completely defeat him. By suing him, Chin-soo made Hae-jun come crawling to him, receiving all the group's attacks without resisting. At that moment, Choi realized that money was another form of strength. That's why he opened his digital shopping center and forced the others to buy from him, earning enough millions for Park Han-jun to be at his feet. That's how Choi became the strongest again. That's why he couldn't understand why the protagonist was now able to hit him not once but twice. Trying to defend himself, he threw a punch at him, but Hae-jun easily evaded it and stomped on his foot, causing him to lean enough to knee him in the face and start a barrage of punches. With nothing else to do, Choi prayed in his mind for one of the girls, Na-yoon, not to look, as she was looking at them with fury, humiliated by the mocking. When Han-jun sent him flying with another punch, he realized how ashamed he was of all this. The protagonist approached with a murderous look, and not knowing what to do, Choi yelled at one of his subordinates, Cho Young-jun, to help him. But he simply ignored him, scared by the black-haired boy's murderous gaze. Realizing this, Choi now takes out his phone and asks Hae-jun if he had the money to pay him when he sues him. A taunt that the protagonist responds to by kicking him in the face and proceeding to deliver a new series of punches that make the redhead wonder if he was going to die there. Terrified by this, the guy crawls out of the classroom and starts running through the hallways. Park Hae-jun follows him, and the redhead begins to think about how to escape the situation, as more than 2 years had passed since he had last fought. Therefore, he decides to go to class 3-8, the class of Park Soo-woon, who would do anything for money. Upon entering the room, he encounters a guy working out with weights, who happens to be Park Soo-woon, and he asks him what happened to his face. The redhead asks him to help him just when the protagonist appears behind him. He tells Soo-woon that if he fights the protagonist, he will give him $1,000,000. The athlete looks at the protagonist, thinks for a moment, and declares that he will do it for $2 million, an offer that the redhead accepts desperately, thinking that any amount was small to stop him. Soo-woon then approaches the black-haired protagonist and apologizes for what he was about to do, mentioning that the entrance exams for the sports university were very expensive. This comment makes things clear to Hejun, who tells him that if he wanted to get into college, they could save themselves the trouble by taking his money and stepping aside. Soo-woon critically examines the bundle of bills before thanking him and stepping aside, making way for Choi and stating that he would use it responsibly. The redhead curses at him while the protagonist approaches. The next thing we see is the so-called boss Choi jumping out of the classroom window, breaking the glass. As Hejun was leaving to continue his rampage, a passing teacher stopped him, furious. Later, both were in that teacher's office, who was yelling at Hejun for his behavior, asking him to reflect on what he had done and making it clear that he couldn't do such things in the institution. While this was happening, Choi took advantage of not being seen to show the middle finger to the protagonist. Then, just when the teacher mentioned his father, Hejun couldn't take it anymore and punched Choi again, then grabbed his shirt and continued to hit him in the face. Of course, the teacher grabbed the protagonist and tried to separate them, but it wasn't until a new man entered the room that it stopped. This man was a guy with glasses who introduced himself as Kim Bum-kwon, the lawyer from KR, the country's most important law firm according to the teacher. This left him stunned, wondering what he was doing there. That night, the protagonist goes to his new boss's building, Junwoo, to ask him how he did that. After the lawyer spoke with the teacher, the school immediately expelled Choi. The blonde just says it was easy because he was only being bullied by Choi since the teacher was on his side, so it wasn't difficult to pressure him to change sides. Curious, the protagonist asks how he did it, and Junwoo shows a picture of the teacher drunk at a party with a guy and a girl, saying he could do many dirty things to get people on his side, submissive. He points out that with his help, they could even send Choi to the juvenile center, although the teacher could also end up in prison. That's why they needed to wait since he didn't intend to spend his resources on people like that teacher. Setting the matter aside, Junwoo asks him if he enjoyed getting revenge on the redhead, which he reluctantly admits. This elicits a malicious smile from the blonde before he gets up to tell him that the real reason he summoned him was to discuss something important. In his apartment, Junwoo, covered in bandages, was cursing Park Hejun for everything he did that day, swearing that he wouldn't let such humiliation pass. He wanted to kill him. The next day, the redhead goes to a residential complex and knocks on the door. Someone looks through the door grill, showing a terrifying eye, and asks him what he wanted. Unfazed, he replies that he was there to review his application. This makes the guy recognize him as Boss Choi and open the door, revealing that he was actually a young blonde man. The blonde welcomes Choi, saying he arrived just in time, and then fully opens the door, revealing the scene inside. A group of men beating a chained guy in a chair with baseball bats. Ignoring all this, the blonde talks to a guy named Jin-seong to inform him of Choi's arrival. A guy with glasses and neatly combed hair answers and tells him to come in. That was Hwang Jin-seong, the leader of the gang. The guy being beaten also recognizes the redhead who arrived and tells him that he deserved the beating he received. It was Park Soo-woon, who now receives a blow to the back of the head, courtesy of Jin-seong. The guy with glasses instructs his henchmen to clean up that mess, as they had guests to attend to. Once they remove Soo-woon's body, Jin-seong directly asks Choi what he came to ask for, as he knew all his favors came with a price. The redhead knows this and responds with an amount, 10 million. The figure astonishes the blonde, who immediately instructs Jin-seong that they don't need to know more and can accept the mission right away. Faced with this, Jin-seong, showing who's in charge, hits his subordinate with his bat, asking him if he'd like to be beaten like a dog in front of the client. The blonde chooses to stay on the ground and apologizes. Jin-seong keeps his bat over his head and goes toward the redhead to say that if he's considering paying such a high amount, the man they need to take care of must not be a normal person. To respond, Choi gives his name, Park Hejun. Hearing this angers the guy with glasses, who declares that taking care of him for only 10 million is an insult. But when he was about to continue, Choi finishes explaining. He'll give them 10 million as a deposit, and if they succeed, he'll double their bonus. They would get 30 million for the job. Upon hearing this, Hejun and even his blonde subordinate open their eyes in surprise and look at him. Now, the guy with glasses, with a sadistic smile, accepts the deal. A house engulfed in flames with police tape around it. That was the place Junwoo was heading to, and he enters with a bag in hand, ignoring security measures. Upon entering, he takes off his shoes and apologizes for not having come in a long time because he was busy, and he mentions that he bought chicken this time. On the table was a family photograph of 3 people whose faces couldn't be seen, with a withered flower in front of it. Junwoo sits on the couch, trying not to look at the photo, commenting that they don't make the chicken like they used to. But he still has cravings for it, logical considering it had been 2 years since he last tried it. 2 years. As he recalls the time that has passed, the atmosphere becomes tenser, and with a hateful expression, Junwoo comments that he still remembers those days as if they had happened just yesterday. A few seconds pass before he gets up, without even trying the chicken, to leave, saying that he won't come again for a long time, as he will probably be much busier taking care of the things that are about to arise. Leaving the house, Kim Bung-kwon was there to inform the businessman that Mr. Choi had moved, and if he wanted him to take care of it. To this, he responds that he already knows his way of doing things, which the lawyer confirmed with an "as you wish." That night, Hajun and his father were in their apartment when the older man receives a call to work at a gym for an annual sum that leaves him quite impressed. Of course, he accepts, and when he hangs up, he informs his son, playfully messing up his hair, that he now has a new job. Then, he begins to wonder why things are going so well for them, and talks about how they could even become millionaires. Hajun just congratulates him and, coldly, tells him he's going to work out. His father doesn't get discouraged and, equally excited, tells him to come back early because they'll have something delicious to eat. Despite his responses, as he leaves, the protagonist gives a genuine smile of joy. Going down the stairs, Hajun receives a call. It was Hajun informing him that Choi had moved, and if he knew anything about them or came across them, he should let her know. The protagonist immediately responds that he shouldn't do that, as when he left his building, he found them all waiting for him outside with bats. Jin-seong says he's delighted to meet him, but when Hajun asks who he is, he notices a car heading towards him, driven by the blonde thug who wanted to run him over, motivated by the 30 million won. Instead of trying to escape, everyone present is surprised to see Hajun running towards the car and stepping on the windshield. Despite their surprise, the blonde continues driving forward, causing the protagonist to roll over the vehicle until he falls on his head, with a trail of blood coming out of him. The gang starts making fun of him for attempting such a crazy stunt. Jin-seong appears more focused on it and orders one of his henchmen to call their boss to inform him that the job was done. But before getting in, he looks at Hajun to mockingly say goodbye with the promise of seeing him again. However, the protagonist doesn't give them a chance to escape and starts running after the car. Of course, the men look through the rear window and taunt him, with one even showing him the middle finger, thinking it impossible for an ordinary person to catch a speeding car. Nevertheless, they all change their expression to one of terror as they see Hajun about to catch up with them. When he manages to position himself behind the vehicle, the protagonist jumps onto it fearlessly and smashes the rear window with a punch. Before anyone can react, Hajun grabs one of the guys, the one who showed him the middle finger, and pulls him out with one hand, causing both of them to fall out of the van, with the gang member receiving the most damage, as he's used as a sort of parachute by Hajun. The rest of the men ask their boss to stop to rescue their comrade, but Jin-seong coldly tells them to leave him while demanding the driver to accelerate. The thug who fell picks himself up from the pavement, holding his aching head. However, his pain takes a backseat when Hajun looks at him, sternly asking him where his group is. The guy nervously defends himself, saying it's impossible for someone like him to know. Hajun doesn't accept this and lifts him by his shirt to give him a punch, demanding that he answer. The guy, mockingly, then asks if he'd like a clue, showing his loyalty. This prompts the protagonist to start hitting him repeatedly, seeking to make him talk. On the other hand, the gang had arrived at their apartment and celebrated with some beers for their good performance that day. Despite Jin-seong praising them, Choi, who was also there, angrily asks why they're celebrating if they weren't able to catch Park Hajun, reminding them that if they accepted his money, they should ensure they do the job. He even questions if they have any security measures, now that Hajun is probably on his way to that place. Jin-seong places his drink on the table and says he understands what he's saying, but explains that with everyone gathered, it wouldn't be the best idea to go after them. He then approaches the redhead and places his arm around his shoulders, asking him if he knew the saying there are knives for killing chickens and knives for killing oxen, and he indicates that what they're hunting now is a tiger. By saying this, he breaks one of the glasses from the top while holding the bottom, and as he touches Choi's face with the broken part, without actually touching him, while slowly bringing the glass closer, he explains that there isn't a knife to catch a tiger, but they must do what they used to do to hunt them. Torture the animal slowly until it wants to die. A month, 2 months, he envisions how they could harm Hejun at the most inopportune moments, like hitting him while walking, throwing a vase at his head on his way back from school, etc. That's how they had planned to execute their plan to kill Park Hye-jun, so he would feel trapped like a tiger with no escape from wild dogs. At the end of his monologue, a loud bang on the door that left a dent surprises them. This surprises them since the door was made of iron. Even so, new blows manage to open up that space more without fully opening it. By their boss's orders, the blonde goes to check through the peephole who it is, being surprised to see that it's Park Hye-jun, with the thug he had captured by the hair. They all become agitated, confused as to how he could know where they were, and they prepare to take out their weapons. However, Jin-seong orders them to calm down because it was impossible for Han-jun to break that door. So if they just left him outside, he would eventually get tired and go home. At that moment, the desperate blows to break the door stopped sounding, and the blonde mockingly declared that even Park Hye-jun was afraid to fight with them. Of course, his confident smile changed completely when, while looking back, he realized that a hand was reaching over the balcony. Hye-jun went to the back of the apartment, broke the window glass to enter. This shocks Jin-seong because they were on the 3rd floor, and yet the raven-haired guy was able to climb to enter and reach them. As soon as he enters, the protagonist uses the momentum from the entrance to kick one of the gang members, causing him to hit a wall. 2 others try to take advantage of his landing to attack from behind, one of them even using a knife. However, Jin-seong was much faster and kicked the guy with the knife while grabbing the bat-wielding guy by the lapels and threw him over the second thug and gave him a punch to the chest. Hye-jun easily takes down 3 people, leaving them piled on top of each other. He then turns to the rest and asks who's next. Of course, when Choi sees this, he becomes concerned. However, when he sees that Jin-seong shows no signs of fear, he starts to doubt. He then recalls that those guys had been able to handle Park Soo-woong easily, and the guys Hye-jun defeated earlier were taken by surprise. Connecting these dots, he assumes they must have some collective strength, an organization that not only matches Park Hye-jun's abilities, but might even surpass them. Now that both sides are face to face, Jin-seong doesn't wait any longer and orders his men to attack. They attack in an organized manner, but Hye-jun breaks their formation by using his leg to trip one of them and then lifting him into the air. He grabs the guy by the foot and throws him against a wall with all his strength. As he turns his back for that move, another one of the thugs tries to hit the protagonist with his bat. However, Hye-jun senses his presence and ducks to then grab the guy by the neck and slam him to the ground. The blonde takes advantage of this to approach and try to hit him. But even though Hye-jun manages to react, the guy he slammed to the ground holds his arm, preventing him from moving, and pleads for them to finish him. Because of this, Hye-jun couldn't do anything and ended up receiving a blow with the bat, which broke over his head. But even though the blonde thinks that such a blow should be enough to defeat him, he is shocked to see Hye-jun, with the blood that was on his face now more splattered, turning to look at him with fury. The next thing that happens is that the blonde is thrown out of the window by one of the glass panels that Hye-jun didn't break earlier, and he falls to the ground. A motorcycle approaches, and a girl gets off it, taking off her helmet and, mockingly, says that the situation is scary. She approaches the almost unconscious guy, who wonders if he might have died since he sees the girl as an angel. Unaware of his thoughts, the girl asks him if Park Hye-jun was upstairs, which the guy confirms while trying to ask for her phone number, blushing. But all he gets in response is a hit with the helmet from the girl. She then sits on her motorcycle to talk to someone on the phone and inform them that Hye-jun would cause a huge commotion and destroy someone's house. So she asks for more instructions. On the other end of the line was Junwoo, who asks her for her location. However, the girl doesn't respond but emphasizes her curiosity about her location and informs him that she also has a curiosity about something, which is that she doesn't know which of the 2 new bags that came out on a website she should buy. A dilemma that supposedly makes it impossible for her to tell him where she is. Junwoo gets frustrated by this move but decides to send her the money to buy both bags. The girl thanks him and informs him of her location while watching a table being thrown out of the window. Inside the apartment, only Hye-jun and Jin-seong were left standing, facing each other as even Choi was semi-unconscious on the floor with a battered face. Knowing that he was outmatched, Jin-seong admits his defeat but curiously asks the black-haired guy why he left him unharmed in the movie. Seeing Hejun approach him, he assumes that the reason was that he wanted his help with something, so he would assist him with whatever he could. However, he is greatly surprised when Hejun grabs him by the neck and reveals that he only wanted to save the worst for last. Angry, Jin-seong starts using his bat to hit him while still in the air, but the protagonist remains unfazed and grabs his bat to swing it and send it flying towards a wall. At this point, the guy in glasses starts to tremble, scared, and Hejun doesn't flinch, mercilessly beating him in the face. From a distance, an overweight guy watches the scene with tears in his eyes, and although he hesitates initially, he finally rushes over to grab Hejun's arm and beg him to stop. Distraught, he pleads with him to stop destroying his house and that if they were going to fight, it would have been much better if they did it outside instead of in his home. In his cries, he reveals that he's an orphan, and Jin-seong's gang took over his house without him being able to do anything, which has only worsened now that Hejun is here just to destroy his property. The protagonist, without changing his cold expression, looks at the man's tears but stops his attacks. Now Junwoo arrives at the scene and asks the protagonist, amazed, what he did to leave the place in such a mess. The owner of the place, exhausted, approaches and asks him if he sent Hejun to destroy his house. The blonde introduces himself as the head of Group Oj and apologizes, saying that he himself will take care of paying 5 times what's needed to cover all the repairs. Upon learning who he is, the owner quickly realizes that he's a millionaire and asks him for 10 million won, wiping away his tears. Without objection, the businessman gives him the money he asked for. Jin-seong is still conscious and, admitting that Park Hejun is a monster and it was an impossible fight to win, decides to flee and tries to jump out of the window, whose glass panels were already fully removed. However, before falling, the protagonist managed to grab him by the shirt, declaring that he hadn't finished with him yet. The guy in glasses doesn't give up and takes out a knife to try to cut the protagonist's hand and break free. His plan is successful, and the protagonist lets him go, although the guy ends up forgetting that he was in the air at that moment and falls into an awkward position on the asphalt, limping away. Junwoo approaches the window and admits that the guy had impressive will to live. Meanwhile, Hejun watches the guy with glasses leave, and for some reason, he decides not to jump to pursue him. Laughter then fills the room as one of the henchmen Hejun defeated earlier smiles and tells him that they're fools for not knowing who they were messing with. Both guys are confused by this, and the gang member continues to explain that they work for someone superior to Hwang Jin-seong, his father, actually, who was the CEO of PJ Hee-woon, an organization that was rich enough to make them disappear without effort. Upon hearing all of this, Junwoo says, with a rather somber expression, that this should be a problem for them. Finally, Jin-seong arrives home, broken, and meets his father, Hwang Haryong, who, as soon as he sees him, approaches to ask who the bastard was that did this to him. The guy in glasses doesn't respond but, unable to open one of his eyes due to the swelling, he asks if he could take care of 2 bastards for him. His father indicates that he might regret that later, but his son replies that he doesn't care, and reveals that the reason for his request was that he was beaten by those guys. His father smiles and says he became a real man after leaving home. However, he points out that he didn't seem trustworthy when asking for help that way because when you ask someone for help, you need to look up and show no signs of weakness, or else people won't support you. He lifts his chin so that his son looks him in the eyes and asks him to think carefully about what he wants and request help properly. Junwoo then takes off his glasses, wipes his face, and, looking directly at his father, tells him that he wants to kill those people at all costs. Haryong, proud, says that he's worthy of being his son. He then takes out his phone to contact someone named Boss Kim and inform him that he'll need some of his men to teach a lesson to some people who have dared to bother him. A line of cars is arranged to go to a construction building, several men carrying weapons, led by Haryong, with Jin-seong by his side. They are led to the top of the structure where 2 figures lurk in the shadows, and one of them comments on how ridiculous it is that so many insects got involved in a child's fight. Haryong responds that they must be eager to die, although Junwoo steps out of the shadows to tell him that nobody wants to die, so he should realize that they had something in mind. He says his name, Boss Hwang Haryong. Seeing him, the man changes his cold expression to one of surprise and fear, recognizing that boy is President Junwoo. As he tries to figure out why he's there, Haryong receives a call. One of his employees informs him that all the agreements for the second half of the year they had with Group Oj had been personally cancelled by President Junwoo, who didn't provide any details. The blonde man yawns with boredom and looks maliciously at the older man. Terrified, realizing the seriousness of the situation, Hae-ryong kneels on the floor and begs for forgiveness. Of course, his men, confused, ask if they shouldn't give him a beating, but he only orders them to be quiet. Junwoo declares that he now understands their situation, so he asks them to get rid of all their men, which he immediately complies with. Once there are only the four of them, Junwoo, Haejun, Hae-ryong, and Jin-seong, the older man asks the blonde, without getting up from the floor, not to cancel the deal because he knows that if his company couldn't make those deliveries, they would be in serious trouble. With an arrogant tone, Junwoo questions if he thought it was something he wanted to do, explaining that he needs to maintain his company's image. In other words, he couldn't work with a gangster's company if he wanted to maintain his image. Hearing this, Hae-ryong declares that he'll send his son abroad to study and make sure he never returns to Korea if necessary. Jin-seong is alarmed and asks why he should go abroad if he's the victim, the one who was beaten. Angry, the man can't contain himself and punches his son in the face, then demands that he shut up while punching him on the floor. This causes the blonde to laugh, sardonically commenting that he isn't surprised by Jin-seong's personality if that was his daily life. Junwoo asks him to stop, not losing his malicious smile, and tells him that sending him abroad wouldn't benefit anyone. Instead, he has a better teaching method in mind, and if he complies, he'll consider not canceling his orders. Desperate, the man says he'll agree to anything, without even hearing his plan. Junwoo explains that he had to spend 50 million won on his son's shares, and although it's not an exorbitant amount for him, it's a large sum for others. That's why he wants Jin-seong to work alone to earn enough money to pay him back. Surprised, Hae-ryong asks the blonde how his son could get so much money. With great sadism, Jin-seong replies that they were supposed to be fishermen, so he can send his son to one of his fishing boats to work, as they pay quite well after all. Jin-seong never lost consciousness, heard everything, and, understanding what awaited him, can't do more than curse mentally. In the middle of a beautiful blue sky, we see a boat sailing the seas with a group of passengers holding some bags. They were fishermen, among them Jin-seong, who was working on this while crying because his father kept his promise and sent him far away to work. Junwoo and Haejun were in their corporate building, in the blonde's office. The protagonist comments that he's like a kind of villain for what he did to Jin-seong. The guy mocks this and states that it's not like they were doing some kind of charity project or something. He also adds that he should avoid getting into new problems that require money from now on, as there was no need for him to get hurt. The protagonist claims that he didn't get hurt, although someone points out a nearly invisible bruise on the back of his neck. The one who points it out is the girl who sent her location to Junwoo earlier, and she mocks him, telling him to stop acting so cold. The blonde introduces her as his partner to take down Nexus, an Instagram celebrity who will act as an informant. The woman scoffs at this title, saying that she got such a job just by talking to them. Her name was Choi Seoyeon, and she had 570,000 followers on her Instagram account. After the introductions, she sits next to the protagonist and admits that she had heard rumors that he seemed like a gangster. But now that she sees him, she realizes he's quite handsome, much to her surprise. Although Haejun doesn't react to her compliments, Junwoo says they had already hired her, so there was no need for her to lie to them. Despite his taunts, the girl raises her middle finger and admits that she actually kind of likes men who resemble more of a bandit than a good boy. The blonde tries to argue, but Seoyeon tries to change the subject by asking why he called her. With veins pulsating on his forehead, Junwoo sits down and explains that he called her to discuss their future plans. Although the girl asks, indifferent, if his plan was limited to letting Park Haejun fight anyone he faced. The blonde clarifies that Nexus's power was currently far beyond his imagination, so Haejun wouldn't be enough to deal with them. Therefore, he had been thinking about increasing the capabilities of his team by recruiting new members. He tosses a folder with the description DONGYEON school and indicates that he already has someone in mind to hire, who is at the school now affiliated with Nexus. Just by seeing the file, the protagonist utters a name, Kim Jong-hyun. The blonde praises him, saying that he had a keen sense because, indeed, Kim Jong-hyun would be his first recruit, remembering how he was the only one willing to fight to the end with Haejun in their battle against Nexus, being the most powerful in that school at the time. Although the protagonist tries to add something, the blonde interrupts, showing that he already knows the truth. During the war against Nexus, Jong-hyun suffered serious injuries to his knee, preventing him from even walking properly. But even with these injuries, Junwoo claims he is someone they urgently need. Haejun looks seriously at his superior, to which he jokes that he should relax his gaze since there's already enough tension in the room. The blonde doesn't back down and says that work is work, so they'll need to take advantage of Jonghyun's connection with Nexus, and he might even use that opportunity to reconnect and make amends. Seeing that he has no other option, Hejun remains silent, although he continues to glare at the blonde. In a school, a group of students comments on how Choi, who was their president, would go to a juvenile detention center. That's why he had to resign from his position, which would bring them a lot of problems when it comes to collecting their money in the future. This causes laughter in one of the guys who comments that Choi knows how to make money but has no experience in politics. To this, another guy questions whether they should do something to rescue him because, after all, he was also a member of Nexus. However, his friend tells him the problem is the guy who sent him to that place, Park Hejun. A silence fills the room until a man with a scar on his jaw coldly asks who that guy is. That man was Min Jongcheol, the strongest student at Donghyun School. While everyone was talking about the protagonist, a guy rushes into the room to inform them that, just as it happened, Park Hejun had transferred to the institution, which surprises everyone present, even Min, who comments that it was unexpected. The protagonist arrives in his new classroom at Donghyun, where he declares directly that he had come to destroy them all. A statement that angers all the students, although the teacher just laughs at it, saying that even the new students are a headache. After this, the teacher tells him to sit at the back, next to a guy with short hair, as it was the only available seat. As he walked, all the guys stared at him, analyzing him, and as soon as he sat down, his classmate greeted him, wanting to confirm if he was Park Hejun. The person speaking to him was the 12th most powerful person in the institute, Jo Wooman. But even being aware of this, the protagonist looks at him with great indifference. Wooman says that Min Jongcheol told him not to mess with him, but he also admits that he'd like to see them fight. He continues his soliloquy, saying that he doesn't really know his reputation since he transferred just last year, but he'd like to test all those rumors about him and see if they were true. So, he suggests that they ignore everyone else and fight there one-on-one. The protagonist, who has been looking at him all the time, shifts his gaze forward without losing his indifferent expression. Wooman notices this and asks him if he's one of those who only fights when people provoke him. In the face of no response, the guy with short hair gets frustrated and slaps the protagonist, asking if he'll really ignore him. When this happens, Hejun elbows him in the face, breaking his nose and slamming him into the lockers behind. Of course, the rest of the students look at this with surprise, but the protagonist only whispers that what he said was true, about needing to provoke him to make him fight. Meanwhile, Seoyeon was with Junwoo, using her phone to pass the time, and she comments that she wasn't sure if they should recruit Kim Jong-hyun out of all the strong guys they could have, arguing that they are not a charity organization or anything like that, so hiring him just because he was a friend of Park Hejun and was injured in the leg doesn't make sense. Junwoo, who is inside a batting cage, mocks this, and while batting a ball, he explains that when people think of Kim Jong-hyun, the first word that comes to mind is tenacity, and that despite having a small build, he was able to fight against Nexus just with his unwavering tenacity. However, he claims that the problem with solid things is that they often break because they're too inflexible, and right at this moment, his bat breaks when hitting the next ball. As if to prove his point, Seoyeon asks again why they should recruit someone who's injured. Junwoo says that he believes that someone who has been broken once will become less inflexible and sharper. While explaining his point, he attempts to hit a ball with the broken bat, failing because it's too short but managing to slice the ball, as if exemplifying what he meant. Seoyeon understands what he means, so she sarcastically tells him he has a sage on his side. Hejun walks through the hallways. Following the scene in the first class, everyone makes way for him, but they look at him with absolute hatred, which puts the protagonist on the defensive, alert for any attack. Then, in front of him, he finds who he wanted to see so much, Kim Jong-hyun, with his distinctive red hair full of wounds. Jong-hyun doesn't notice his presence because he's running while looking to his left. But even looking in that direction, he couldn't foresee a kick from a guy in his stomach, making him fall and dropping several snack bags. This guy curses him, saying that he probably arrived late on purpose, not understanding how it took him 5 minutes for a single trip and that he lost everything in a bet because of him. Interrogated about what he'd do, he starts banging his head against a wall in the middle of the hallway, and nobody cares. In fact, several guys inside the classroom make fun of him, saying that it was impossible to get to the cafeteria quickly with his useless legs in less than 5 minutes. Although this guy indicates that all he needed was for him to fear him more than his weak legs, so he starts hitting him in the face. Despite being humiliated, Hajun remains standing in the middle of the hallway, watching the whole scene with anger, not doing anything and not being noticed. Back in Jiwoon's office, Seo-eun confesses to her boss that she understood why they should recruit Kim Jong-hyun, but can't imagine Park Hajun being good at working as a team with someone else. Therefore, she suggests that maybe things would be better if they just solved them with money. Jiwoon thinks about it and admits that things would be that simple if Kim Jong-hyun were easily swayed by money, revealing that the only reason he fought that day was because Park Hajun fought. While it might seem strange to others to fight to the point of losing one's own leg for someone else, the blonde admits that he understood why Jong-hyun did it, and it's because he's the type of person who fights alongside his friends and treats the blows they receive as if they were hitting him. Back in school, we see Dong-hyun sitting on a bench in the courtyard, trying to smoke a cigarette, but his lighter doesn't work, so he ends up frustrated and throws it on the ground. This object falls at Hajun's feet, who exchanges glances with the redhead for several seconds until he finally greets him, saying it's good to see him again. Jong-hyun responds, revealing that he heard he came to the school with the intention to destroy it, and he asks if he believed it was possible, considering that Nexus had become much more powerful in recent times, with a workforce and capital he couldn't handle, which only meant the end of things. They lost the war. The protagonist indicates that no, this time he was sure they would win. Jong-hyun looks at him with boredom and stands up while telling him that he wouldn't have fought in the first place if he thought they would lose, and thanks to that, he ended up as a cripple. Although he keeps a calm face, Hajun clenches his fist with anger and says that he just has to wait and see. Near a window on the upper floor, Min Jeong-cheol watched the entire scene, admitting that he was intrigued to know exactly what the protagonist would do. He is disappointed to learn that all he will do is try to ally with the guy who limps, classifying him as a complete idiot. He instructs the dozens of guys behind him to get ready because it was time to give Park Hajun a beating. That night, Jong-hyun was in his doctor's office, who explained to him that even though it was good that he worked hard on his physiotherapy exercises, the longer he delayed the surgery, the lower the probability of recovering from his knee injury would become. The doctor understands that he's in a difficult situation but still asks him to go to a larger hospital, or he could risk losing the full mobility of his legs. Looking at the floor gloomily, Jong-hyun says yes. It was raining when he left the facility, but he wasn't as bothered by it as he was by the person who greeted him to ask what the doctor said, Min Jeong-cheol. Seeing him, the redhead hardens his gaze and asks what he was doing there, something that amuses Jeong-cheol with a mocking tone, saying he had the right since he was still his friend and was sad. Although he then adds that maybe not so much and admits that he would like to check the condition of the former best student of Dong-eun's school, while looking at his limbs sadistically. So he approaches and asks him again if he has recovered from his leg so he can break it again. Jong-hyun is not upset but only asks him why, if that's what he wanted, he didn't bring the rest of his subordinates, as it would be impossible for him to do it alone if he was healed. This infuriates Jeong-cheol, who kicks him in the leg, making him fall into the puddle easily. Seeing him on the ground, he laughs, asking if he really believed he was still his subordinate, something that makes Jong-hyun look at the ground with frustration, while the scar-faced guy starts to walk away. However, before leaving, Jeong-cheol tells him not to have foolish thoughts and asks if he remembers when Park Hajun kneeled, and how he ended up crippled because of his stupid loyalty. Despite his attempts to humiliate him, the redhead looks Jeong-cheol in the face and clarifies that he only ended up like that because he betrayed him and Hanjun to join Nexus. This brings a new smile to Jeong-cheol, who says he's talking about him as if he were a real bastard, a statement that, for the first time in the conversation, wipes the smile of superiority off Jong-hyun's face. Then, Jeong-cheol responds that he can think whatever he wants, as it wouldn't change the fact that he was only the bastard who remained loyal to his friend until the end, and he would prefer to be a bastard than a cripple. Curiously, he says that he'll soon see if this time he can keep his word until the end. Finally, the man with the scar leaves, leaving the angry redhead on the ground, soaked. Next, we find the protagonist in his classroom. The sky remained cloudy when a voice begins to repeat over the loudspeakers. It was Min Jeong-cheol, who starts talking about how Park Hajun fought against Nexus 2 years ago, and how he promised to destroy them all after transferring, something he categorizes as stupid and imbecilic acts. He starts laughing, asking the protagonist if he would seriously be able to attack them after they tore him apart. Jeong-cheol admits, as all the male student body rises, that he was strong in one-on-one fights. That's why he wasn't stupid enough to face him by himself, only. Several students start picking up various weapons, sticks, pipes, and head to a classroom, while Jeong-cheol proclaims something from now on. Just when two guys escape through the window, the leader of Dongyun's school declares that from now on Park Hae-jun will see his end. And with those words, an all-out brawl begins with everyone against the protagonist. Although he has no qualms about facing them, throwing a guy towards the door, making it fall, and planting his foot on his face. One of the guys looks, with surprise, that all the guys from Class 7, where Hae-jun was, had been defeated and were scattered throughout the room. Park Hae-jun breathes heavily and addresses the entire school, saying that today they will see who the predator is. The crowd rushes toward him, clamoring for his death. The protagonist defends himself, punching the first guys who approach him. While this scene unfolds, Jonghyun is sitting, the only one left in his classroom, trying to ignore the developing conflict. A storm rages outside, while inside a fierce battle is taking place. Hae-jun kicks an enemy with his kick, punches another with his left hand, takes advantage of the momentum and kicks another student approaching from behind, making him fall onto another guy. They call him a monster for his ruthlessness. One of them realizes that his movements were not impulsive but that he genuinely believed he could defeat them all. Some guys step back when someone shouts to catch him to limit his movements. Then, just as he punches another student, a guy rushes to grab Hae-jun's torso, and he shakes him off by elbowing him but gives an opportunity for a guy to grab him from behind by the neck, while others hold onto his arms. With no way to move, the boys start coordinating to attack simultaneously all over his body. Angry, the protagonist sees an opportunity and steps on the guy in front to make him bend a little and takes advantage to knee him in the nose, then places his feet on the torso of another student and uses him as leverage to jump back, falling on those holding him, freeing himself. Instantly, he takes advantage of hitting the guy holding him by the neck while turning his elbow to knock out the one who approached from behind. The protagonist was able to keep fighting, with just a trickle of blood dripping from his head. A guy wonders how they could allow themselves to be beaten if they outnumbered him. Hae-jun doesn't care about this and starts running forward, hitting anyone in front of him mercilessly, knocking them out in a second. When he stops, he leaves a corridor full of the bloodied bodies of Dongyun students. He had won against the wave and starts breathing heavily from the effort. A guy with long hair approaches from the front with another group and mockingly asks if he was already tired. A row of guys filled the lower staircases, advancing down the corridor where he had just fought. This wasn't good, the fight had just begun. Hae-jun gives them a determined look. In Jeongcheol's classroom, he kept staring into space while a group of guys ran between classrooms, looking to fight with Park Hae-jun, who apparently had almost no strength left. Upon hearing this, the redhead calls himself a fool in his head and wonders why he had to start that conflict again if everything was already over. These thoughts are interrupted by Seo-eun, who questions if Hae-jun wouldn't be disappointed in him for sitting, as if nothing was happening, while he was fighting. After her observation, the girl introduces herself, to Jonghyun's confusion, wondering what she wanted. Seo-eun thinks and says she's one of Park Hae-jun's colleagues. This surprises the redhead, who decides to answer her previous question, confessing that he couldn't fight. Despite his words, Seo-eun states that she wasn't there to try to convince him but just wanted him to talk about Park Hae-jun since, as far as she knew, he was fighting with the entire school, even though they told him earlier that it wasn't necessary, and he could escape if things got complicated. So, she asks him if he knew the reason for that because he only told them that he wanted to try again, that this time he could win. Jonghyun doesn't respond but starts to have memories, his friend asking him to fight, Jeongcheol insulting him, himself on the ground, while it was raining, regretting not knowing if he could keep his loyalty this time. Trying to appear indifferent, the girl looks away and asks him if he was sure he wouldn't regret the decision he was making. Hae-jun, on the other hand, was still fighting, delivering a flying kick that ends with the enemies in a hallway. However, when it seemed he had defeated all the waves, muffled applause is heard that sends a chill down his spine. Jeongcheol comes down the upper stairs, congratulating him for coming this far, as expected of him. He asks how many he defeated. However, he immediately tells him that his streak is over. As a group follows him, including himself, there were the 7 strongest people from Dongyun's school he now had to face. Seeing the way he was breathing heavily, stumbling, and wounded, Jeongcheol claims they are at his same level. Despite the odds against him, the protagonist takes a fighting stance, so the group's leader orders them to attack. But when one of the guys was about to hit him, a broomstick strike leaves him on the floor. Not only Jeongcheol but Hae-jun himself are surprised to see who helped him. It was Jonghyun, who was on the other side of the hallway. With a broomstick, he looks annoyed at the raven-haired guy and says he was such a nuisance for wanting to do all the cool things alone. Far away, on a desk, you can see an open briefcase filled with dozens of 101 bills. But what was more striking was a frame in the middle, which had a photo of Jonghyun and Hejun hugging, happy as friends. One of the remaining students expresses his astonishment because Jonghyun wants to fight them again. Although Jeongcheol admits he won't worry about it since it would make things much more interesting. Regardless of this union, they could take care of both guys without much trouble. Two guys go directly for the redhead, while he breaks the broomstick to divide it and have one in each hand. When a fist was headed for his face, Jonghyun uses one of his sticks to block it, hitting the inner elbow, and uses the other to strike the head. Then, he centers both sticks and opens himself to hit both guys simultaneously, and then gives a knee strike to the other guy he had hit less. But although his moves are successful, he shows a hint of pain from using the leg he has injured. This doesn't stop him from continuing to attack these two individuals and the third one joining them. Meanwhile, Hejun was doing the same, directing his punches at all the students coming after him. Both guys fought against all the new students who appeared, quickly knocking them out as they approached. Something incredible that surprises those present since, according to their comments, one was disabled, and the other was tired, yet they were defeating them. Finally, they managed to defeat this new wave and regroup, now standing back to back. Despite being in the middle of a fight, Hejun apologizes to his friend, although Jonghyun admits that he was the person he blamed the most for his current life. But now he accepts that it wasn't his fault what happened, he just wanted someone to blame for his troubles. Understanding the kind of apology the redhead gives him, Hejun turns around and gives a discreet smile. However, this moment doesn't last long since Jeongcheol comes from above, claiming that if they wanted to die, he would grant their wish. The protagonist takes a fighting stance, but Jonghyun asks him to leave it to him. Before hitting the ground, the duo manages to dodge the attack, each going in different directions and starting to run. Flee, that's what Jeongcheol thought they were doing, and scolds them for showing such cowardice while chasing the protagonist to a door. But when the guy was halfway, Hejun stops and applies a hold that throws him forward, crossing the door they were heading to first. The man with a scar curses as he gets up, only to be amazed to see that Jonghyun was also inside the room, sealing the place from the inside with tape. Again, Jonghyun and Hejun stand back to back, now with a glass wall separating them, but both promising each other that they would finish soon, one with the remaining students, and the other with their leader. Jeongcheol taunts his opponent, stating that he was about to do something stupid. But Jonghyun tells him that a fool like him, who has no friends, wouldn't understand. An insult that angers the man with the scar, who throws a punch at him, which is easily stopped by his enemy placing the broken part of one of the broomsticks in front of him. This ends up breaking part of his hand. Due to the surprise of the movement, he didn't have time to react when Jonghyun attacked him in the torso with both sticks. However, due to his large body, Jeongcheol doesn't back down as much as expected and takes advantage to attack the redhead, lifting him over his shoulders and throwing him against a mirror in the room. Following this, Jeongcheol attempts to hit him, but Jonghyun manages to get off the floor before the attack and runs to the other side of the room. However, this movement causes him to drop the sticks he had used as weapons. Jonghyun points it out and, mockingly, asks him if he's okay with fighting against him barehanded. In response, the redhead takes off his shirt, leaving only a t-shirt. He then ties his white shirt around one of his sleeves and asks him, in the same mocking tone, who decided that. Seeing how the redhead runs towards him, he mocks him for thinking that t-shirt could help him in any way. In the end, the bigger man can't do anything when Jonghyun, with a swift move, manages to place the shirt on his face and, with both hands, use it as leverage to throw him on the floor. Then, he stands over him and starts hitting his face repeatedly. However, his movements are stopped when Jeongcheol grabs his leg and manages to throw him back to apply a leg lock. This allows Jeongcheol to remove the shirt and, with a sadistic look, he says that they are no longer the same as before. Then, he takes advantage of his new position to deliver a powerful blow to Jonghyun's knee that makes him scream in pain. Due to the pain, the redhead stays in a fetal position on the floor, in pain, holding his knee while his opponent gets up. Before leaving, Jeongcheol tells him that what he did would have a high cost that he would have to pay later. But as he was about to unlock the door to leave, Jonghyun gets up, trembling, insulting him while asking where he was going. Indignant, the guy with the scar asks how he could keep going even after being beaten like that. With determination, Jonghyun only says that they haven't finished yet, a statement that increases Jeongcheol's fury, and he proceeds to punch him several times in the face, offended that he still challenges him in such a way. He then gives him a punch to the chest that sends him into another mirror before falling to the floor. Now, confident of his victory, the man leaves. But Jonghyun continues to say that it's not over yet while gripping the floor in anger, ignoring that glass fragments embed in his hand. Fed up with it all, Jeongcheol approaches him, ready to hit him again. However, the blow is interrupted by a hook that the redhead performs with an open hand, cutting his face. In shock, Jeongcheol watches as Jonghyun uses the glass in his hand to cut him. Again, Jonghyun attacks him with an open hand, scratching the other side of his face. A thought floods the mind of the man with the scar, and that is that he had to end this. He throws a right hook that Jonghyun manages to evade by ducking. The redhead grabs him by the lapels to tell him, furiously, that he couldn't lose now if he wanted to appear strong again in front of Park Hae-jun. Then, he connects a powerful headbutt to his nose that leaves him stunned for a few seconds, which he uses to deliver punches to his face, now with a closed fist. This display of skills makes Jeongcheol realize something, that Jonghyun was extremely dangerous. As he falls to the floor, memories flood him, the day he broke Jonghyun's knee and left him on the ground like trash, the moment he mocked him as he left the hospital, all the mistreatment he received from the other students, showing who the new owner of the school was. He remembers how happy he was to see the desperation on the redhead's face. Now, his gaze can only see Jonghyun's face, full of determination, before delivering a final blow that sends him flying into a mirror, rendering him unconscious. He had won, Jonghyun knew it, but he nervously looks at his trembling leg. After a few moments, he leaves the room to meet Park Hae-jun, who had just finished with the remaining students. Seeing this scene, the main character falters, showing surprise that he had really won. Fortunately, Hae-jun takes him before he falls and puts his arm on his shoulder to help him move. Both guys exchange a smile, although Jonghyun, in a friendly manner, asks his partner why he's smiling, referring to him as a cripple. The protagonist simply tells him that he did a good job. Then, the president of Dongyeon High School, Lee Sajang, wonders what happened in his school, looking at the wreckage. With just a glance, he declares that Min Jeongcheol did something stupid. Although he thinks for a few seconds and asks if Park Hae-jun had anything to do with it, something one of his employees confirms. The 34-year-old man is outraged by this, sarcastically commenting if the school was always this pretty. After this, he gives a smug smile and demands that his workers find the boy, making sure to break him into 3 pieces himself. His men gather to enter the school, but then a voice interrupts them to prevent this. It was lawyer Kim Bun-kwon, who asks him to let the kids talk among themselves, so the adults can do the same. So, both men, surrounded by their respective escorts, sit face to face in one of the few school classrooms that were not destroyed, to talk. Lee Moongal is surprised that Park Hae-jun has enough money to hire the KR law firm. He also questions the bespectacled man if the law includes beating up other people, showing reluctance not to punish the protagonist. The lawyer simply has his men release 3 briefcases, stating directly that he wasn't there to fool around and that's why he brought something not to disappoint him. This causes a smirk on the president's face, who tells him it was evident he had experience in negotiations, but clarifies that he wouldn't take the content of the briefcases unless it's yellow inside, referring to the 50,000 won bills that are yellow in color. However, he is surprised when his men open the briefcases, and literally, they contain a row of documents, discs, and memories. With irony, he takes one of the documents and admits it's not the yellow he was expecting. Kim Bun-kwon explains that this document contains tomorrow's headline, which reports how Dongyeon School perpetuated school violence and recruited the most violent students into its gangs. He adds that he has evidence of other crimes he committed, such as using the money obtained from the school foundation for his own purposes, the illegal acquisition of certain lands, tax evasion, and any other crimes he would like to add. Of course, this angers Sajang, who looks at him with a grim face and asks if he had thought everything through while preparing his accusations, as with a simple order, he could end his life. He declares while one of his men places a blade at his throat. Kim Bun-kwon's henchmen draw their weapons, ready to attack as well. Kim Bun-kwon doesn't flinch at the threat and urges him to go on if he thinks everything would end with his death. He just leans forward and asks him what he thought would happen if his law firm got into a fight with the Dongyeon institution. Which of the 2 organizations would emerge victorious, especially if it includes the death of one of the law firm's lawyers within his institution. Lee Sajang matches his gaze with the same intensity but then instructs his guys to stand down. More aware of his position, Kim Bun-kwon directly asks him what he wanted from him. The lawyer simplifies it as something very easy. He just wanted him to hand over that school. A request to which he only responds with a confused "A." In a hospital, another important scene was taking place. Seo-eun shouted at the protagonist, a mix of surprise and anger, asking if he was human or a robot because he was still fine despite fighting with the entire Dongyun school and having nothing more than a few bandages on his body. To this, Hejun replies that he wasn't really fine. A doctor comes out of the emergency room, causing great fear in the two because of the information he was about to give. The doctor comments that he doesn't know how he endured so much pain before revealing that Jonghyun was in good condition for the moment, although he had fallen into a deep sleep, so they would have to monitor him for a while. However, despite these unforeseen events, the surgery was a success, and he had a high probability of making a full recovery from his injury. Seo-eun comments that it's a good thing. Hejun doesn't say anything but drops his head with a smile, with a few tears coming from his face. On the other hand, Junwoo was in a bar restaurant checking his phone. Meanwhile, at another table, a woman thanks a guy with white hair for agreeing to an interview with successful youth, which will help many students, something the young white-haired guy expresses happiness about. It then shows what Junwoo was reading, which was the article that Kim Bun-kwon had threatened to publish. The article informs that Junwoo Jeongcheol, whose name they kept anonymous, was sent to a juvenile detention center for the next 23 months for assaulting and extorting his classmates for 2 years, while the Lee president, whose name turned out to be false as well, was also involved, although the screen doesn't show all the information about his fate. Anyway, Junwoo smiles maliciously at this and gets up to leave, just as the lady says goodbye to the white-haired guy and leaves. As she was about to leave, the mysterious guy catches Junwoo's attention, saying that he noticed a while ago that something strange was happening. His team never changed their original schedule to schedule the interview that they just did for a magazine. Because of this, the guy asks Junwoo directly if he was the one who pushed for that interview. That guy was Kim Chun-soo, the leader of Nexus. Although he doesn't admit it, the white-haired guy knows that his assumption is correct, so he says that it's an honor that the president of the Oj group wanted to talk to him. Junwoo scoffs at this and asks him if he's being so formal and polite because he forgot who he was. As Junwoo sits down, Chun-soo clarifies that it's not like that, but he has changed a lot since those days. Thus, he goes on to say that the past should stay in the past because he is now nothing more than a professional player who is with the president of a multi-billion-dollar company. That's why he is extending a call of respect to someone he admires. Junwoo admits that he's glad he understands his new position, although he feels disappointed by his statement because he was someone who obsessed over the past, which is why he devoured Dongyun school. This statement makes Chun-soo, for the first time, show his surprise, although he claims he doesn't know what he's talking about. Despite this, he says goodbye, stating that he will leave if he has nothing more to tell him, leaving his tea unfinished, and extends his hand, saying it was a pleasure to meet him. Junwoo doesn't show as much restraint and just looks at his hand disdainfully, forcing the white-haired guy to bow as a sign of respect and leave the place. Before leaving, Junwoo calls him one last time to tell him that the next time they meet, it will be quite difficult for him to keep his calm expression. Chun-soo simply nods with a smile before this, but as soon as he continues on his way, his expression changes to one of absolute hatred. Once alone, Junwoo leans back in his seat, admitting that every time he saw his face, it made him angry. Although he thinks that maybe he's scared of the old memories that haunt him, he downplays it by saying that, from his face, it's clear that Chun-soo is just as upset as he is about running into each other. On his part, Kim Chun-soo was in his limousine when the driver asked him with a lot of confidence what he planned to do with Hanjun and Junwoo, to which the gamer replied that since they are the ones with the weapon, they should show how they react. He then mentioned that everyone was excited because, very possibly, that war between them would be recorded as the biggest fight in the history of Korea. It was night, and a handsome guy with brown hair and eyes asked the others what the urgent attention call was for, as he needed to hurry since he had a very busy schedule to fulfill. He was Cho Tae-soo, the director of the Jeonggi branch. Two guys respond in part that it was what they had to do because it was what they were ordered. One had long red hair, Lee Moon-gil, director of the Chungcheon branch, and the other was a large, dark-haired guy, the director of the Gangwon branch, Kim Jae-hyuk. On the other hand, a guy with a mole under his eye and a docile face was looking at Seoul from the window, praising the beautiful view. He was the director of the Jeolla branch, Jocheon Jae-woo. One guy just stared at the calm guy with boredom. Despite his young appearance, he was dressed quite formally and was the director of the Gyeongsang branch, Baek Dongcheon. Another guy, who had a large scar that covered half of his forehead and passed through his eye, sat rigidly in his seat, indifferent to the conversation of the others. He was the director of the Incheon branch, Nam Incheon. Seeing who all were present, Cho Tae-soo raised his voice again to ask if they had gathered to talk about Park Hajuan, who was supposed to have kept a low profile since Chinsu ruined his life with his money. Lee Moon-gil, the redhead, confirms this, but before sharing the rumors he heard, Baek Dong-chin, implying he was the last to join the group, asked who this Park Ha-joon guy was and why he was so important that they had gathered everyone in Seoul. The redhead scoffs at this, reminding him that he didn't know because he only joined Nexus just last year. So, since it would be sad if he were the only ignorant one, he decides to explain it. Although he doesn't reply in any way, the arrogance in his response makes Baek Dong-chin give him a murderous look while gritting his teeth. Then, Lee Moon-gil proceeds to explain that 2 years ago, Park Ha-joon was a very dangerous guy who had a small territory in Seoul, which he ruled as he pleased. Although Nexus usually took control of all the surrounding territories, including those outside of Seoul, they had many problems taking over Ha-joon's Park territory. Of course, this situation was quite embarrassing for the organization and led to the ex-leaders of other territories they had previously dominated to see Park Ha-joon as a symbol of hope and begin to rebel against Nexus, resulting in several attacks. So, they had to gather all their forces to deal with Park Ha-joon. But, of course, if everything had been that easy, they wouldn't be there gathered. Despite having all the resources and a considerable numerical advantage, something surprising that exceeded their expectations happened. They lost every single battle they fought against him head-on. And what's worse, Nexus was on the verge of collapsing. Intrigued, Baek Dong-chin asks if that was possible. Lee Moon-gil smiles and, recalling the dark look of the main character, replies that it was easy to believe if he saw that monster fight. Upon hearing his explanation, Baek Dong-chin lets out a loud laugh that surprises everyone. Then he asks if they didn't lose all their fights because everyone was weak. This provokes the anger of several of those present, who glare at him. Lee Moon-gil warns him not to get cocky if he didn't want to be put in his place. Kim Jae-hyuk puts a hand in front of him to stop him and says that the guy was right. To this, Choi Tae-soo admits that he thought the same, although he also says that all of that happened 2 years ago, so he doesn't think Nexus should be making such a fuss now about Park Ha-joon, implying that they now had a way to defeat him for real. Jo Chin-jae, the guy with the mole, thinks there was no need for so much aggressiveness because one could never be too careful. He adds, without taking his eyes off the window, that although it might seem like a waste of time, today could become a day of great importance. At the end of his sentence, for the first time, Nam In-chin, the scarred man, relaxes his posture to look straight ahead, all to see the last person to arrive, Kim Chin-soo, who greets them all with a smile. Kim Jae-hyuk asks if now everyone who said they could come is in the room. The white-haired guy confirms this and apologizes for calling them so urgently, suggesting they all go for a meal once they finish their meeting. He quickly gets to the main topic and informs them of the reason for their meeting, which everyone had suspected. Park Ha-joon has become active again, and the best counterattack he sees is to start a war. Although he claims the final decision is up to him, he considers it a decent thing to communicate his strategy to them. Most of those present don't like this, and their faces darken at the news. One of the two people who don't seem to be upset was Choi Tae-soo, who raises his hand to give his opinion. The brown-haired guy thinks they should be careful and asks if that was really the best course of action because it seemed like they were making too much fuss about a school being taken. Upon hearing this, Chin-soo gives a big smile but exudes a dark aura that makes those present even more nervous, including Choi Tae-soo, who looks away from him. The white-haired guy asks if he really thought he was making a fuss, further diminishing Tae-soo. No, someone says, but it's not the brown-haired guy, it's Nam In-chin, who says he didn't think they were making a fuss, and he even offers to take care of Park Ha-joon. Chin-soo calms down, although he still displays his devilish smile, and asks his partner if he thought it would be fine because the method he used before wouldn't work easily again since Ha-joon now has a quite important benefactor. Therefore, they'll have to prepare much better to deal with him. In response, Nam In-chin points to his scar and declares that after he got it, there hasn't been a single moment when he wasn't prepared for anything. At that moment, Chin-soo reveals that Nam In-chin had a personal issue with Park Ha-joon, which is why he could trust him especially to carry out that mission. Even so, he chooses to put the decision to a vote and asks for the opinions of the other members of Nexus, who, in their unique ways, end up accepting it. Thus, Kim Chin-soo unleashes the man with the scar and concludes the meeting. In his mind, Nam In-chin thinks he could finally get revenge on Park Ha-joon for what he did to him. A group of motorcycles, coordinated, gathers at a lighthouse dimly lit by a barrel on fire. There, In-chin awaited them, showing his happiness that they were finally all together. With a serious face, he informs them that the day they had been waiting for had finally arrived, the day they could put an end to Park Han-jun. One of the gang members, a large and obese man, shows particular excitement, moving closer to the center, pushing some of his companions, just to confirm with his boss if it was true, if they could finally kill Park Ha-jun. And that's how the first part of this manhwa ends. If you have reached this part of the video, let me tell you that you have been one of the few people to make it here. So comment the word fighter in the comments. Remember to subscribe to not miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.